something has to change, does it not? Like, I'm not talking about JBD and Eric Brandstrom. If those 7 guys they currently have in Ottawa, what do you do to make that a better defensive group? Now, because I'm telling you, I listened to Troy Mann this week on TSN radio, and he said what we've all been saying, that Eric Brandstrom is not doing enough stuff to play at the NHL level, and that Jacob Bernard-Docker is seeing now the competitiveness of playing at a different level, and he has to adjust to it, and he's not adjusting to it just yet. So he's not NHL ready.
No.
So like those guys are not the answer. So with what they've got, what do they do to fix this defensive hold?
Well, and that's something that I think a lot of people tend to forget, right? Like, and I talked about this a lot last year when toward the end of the season, into the summer, about JBD. And I know I was mentioning how I don't, like, and I've been saying this about a lot of these young prospects. I'm a little apprehensive into thinking that they're going to come in here and just change the back end right away. Like we all know it, Wally. It takes years to develop, especially on D, like to mature and get to that comfort zone where, like for me, for example, I didn't really come into my own until I was at 25, 26. So it does take time and you have to be patient. So your answer, to answer your question, I should say, Wally, if you are asking me, well, we're not allowed to go pick a player, is the answer internally, what would you do with the current, personnel that you have on the back end? I would just suggest, you're going to have to work with them. There's going to be a ton of meetings, but the biggest takeaway for me is just to be patient. I don't know that you can turn it around with the current group back there. They're so thin on their second and third pairings. And then when you are taking guys like Nick Holden out of the lineup, for rest or because he's bumped, or I don't know what's wrong with Nick Holden. And I don't know if that was a scratch, if he was actually banged up a little bit. But to me, he's probably your best defensive player after Zub and Shabbat, defensively, as far as not being a liability in his own end and being consistent. So what do you do? Well, Brandstrom, you nailed it right there. He's not exactly knocking the door down in Belleville, so you can't bring him up. We talk about JBD. He's still so young. Like, you can't expect him to come up and turn it around either. I like the best case scenario, assuming you could do this, is to go after another defenseman. And there are some options around there. The problem is, what are you willing to give up? And you obviously don't want to break up any of the glue guys up front, the young players in the organization. They do have a ton of prospects. They've got some goaltender depth, but you're going to have to give up some stuff, right? So for me right now, if I had to correct anything back there, I would just sit them down and say, listen, you guys have to start communicating way better. I'm seeing some matchups, some mismatches that are happening in the D zone where guys are jumping the gun a little too early. They're not playing with enough poise. They're not handling pucks enough. It's all the basic stuff. So I could go on and on and on about what they should be doing differently, but sometimes it just comes down to your personnel. And maybe you don't have enough real established NHL players back there to lead the ship. So I don't like what I'm seeing on the back end after that first pairing, Wally. There are a lot of concerns. I don't know how you fix it with the current guys that you have.
Okay, so they've got different, obviously, people than they had last year. Basically, they've changed over 3 guys. Is this a coaching issue or is this still personnel? Can some of this stuff?
No, it's not a coaching. No, you trust me. This is not a coaching issue. They've done, they're doing as good a job as they can with the personnel they have. Look around the NHL, for example. Like, if you're a fan and you're watching tonight's game, or you're watching the Minnesota game or the Rangers game, look at the depth on the top, at least on the top 2 pairings on a lot of these teams.
Sure.
You can't compare. Like, you just can't. Really, you can't. Like, look at Vegas tonight. Look at their top 4, for example. Even their 6 guys. Their bottom pair is better than our second pair in Ottawa. So this is just a personnel and depth thing. And again, it's hard. You can never match up development with the young guys that are coming in with your forwards. That's almost impossible to do. So you're in a position now, if you're Ottawa, obviously you're not going to go after some rental guy that's up in the summer. You need to find a player that's currently under contract for the next couple of years. Maybe he's having a down year somewhere else that you think would fit in well with this group. I don't know where you find it. Obviously, if you're Ottawa, you can't be pushing the panic button, although I feel like you are there, but they can't just go out and grab whoever they can immediately. You got to take your time, defer to your scouting, make sure that you're picking a player that does have some serious upside, that isn't over the hill and in his mid 30s. Yeah. Go after a guy that still has some decent legs, maybe still under contract for the next 2 years at least, that you can trust on a sweetheart deal. Now, those are very hard to find. And I know it's easier said. We could sit here and debate it all we want over a podcast. It's much more difficult to actually go out there and do it. So it'll be interesting to see who they go after. It's clear though now, Wally, that there's a personnel issue and they have to get somebody to help out.
Well, they had those opportunities and they ended up with Braden
And that's
Coburn and Michael
yes.
Del Zotto, right?
There's
And
been so
Eric
many
Brand.
misses. Yes,
So I don't know if
exactly.
I
So
trust
they
them to go
have
do
gone
it.
out. No, and you're right. You nailed it right there. Like those are players that should have panned out. Like, and I'm not necessarily surprised that some of those guys didn't pan out. I could have called that right from the get-go, but like those were the attempts to
Okay.
bring in some veteran leadership to lead forward, and they were not good pickups. And it's as
Okay,
simple as that.
So here's Methot. You played 600 games. You just recently retired. How is it that you can tell this and the guys who are in charge of running National Hockey League teams can't?
Well, I didn't mind the Coburn deal. Mind you, that one didn't work out well at all because I hadn't seen Braden play very much toward the end of my career. I was in the West in Dallas and I was hurt. So, but like, you know, with the good Branson deal, the Del Zotto deal, I was a little skeptical with that because for me, when I look at defensemen, when you're picking up, the first thing I think of is, can this guy move? Can he keep up?
Yeah.
A lot of coaches, a lot of scouts will look at it maybe a little differently sometimes. And they'll look at a player and they see a Del Zotto or a good Branson or players like that, and they still see the player that was in their prime, right? But can they still keep up is the big question. And a lot of defensemen, unless you're an elite guy in the league, a lot of players on D especially start to lose a step, especially into their 30s, right? Like you're not going to be the same player you are. And that's where you have to do a good job assessing guys. Like you got to know who you're picking up. So I'll look at that and see their skating. Can they keep up with the play? Are they still, because you're not going to expect them, like you're not going to bring in some of those guys and expect them to lead by any means. But your first thought is, can they keep up and provide 20 minutes a night for this group? And if they can't, then you're going after the wrong guy. For me, if you're going to go after a player, you got to get a guy in his mid-20s who can still move, who still has some juice for the next 6 to 7 years. That way, at least you're safe and you can mold him to your liking so he can adjust to your systems. But when you got a guy that can't even keep up, you're already behind the 8 ball before you even started.
They could use a guy that could play 30 minutes. I will point that out. So if they can find one of those guys,
yeah, they could use a couple.
They could use a couple.
But again, I'll leave it at this last note. It's easy to point the finger at the GM or at the coach or whatever. But I think we've all established now as a fan base and as media people, the issue is a personnel issue. And until you address that, it's not going to get any better.